You spent 31 years pouring concrete and you think that makes you somebody? Look at this table. Look at what a real provider looks like. My daughter said that to me in front of 60 people at her engagement party, in a backyard strung with white lights and rented heaters, holding a glass of champagne someone else had paid for. Then she turned, took Marcus Whitfield's arm, and lifted her glass toward him like she was toasting a king. The band kept playing. Nobody stopped them. But everyone near us went quiet, and I felt 60 pairs of eyes measuring me the way you measure a stray dog that's wandered into a wedding, wondering who's going to be the one to walk it out. 31 years building other people's dreams, while your own daughter had to explain to her friends why her dad still drives a truck with rust on the tailgate. She wasn't finished. Her voice carried, sharp and bright, practiced, like she'd said versions of this before when I wasn't in the room. Marcus built something real. Marcus built a company. What did you build, Dad? A garage? Her fiancé's mouth curled at the corner, not quite a smile. The kind of expression a man wears when he's enjoying something but doesn't want to be caught enjoying it. He set his drink down, walked over, put his hand on my daughter's waist like he was claiming territory, and said, in that smooth, sanded-down voice rich men use when they want to sound generous while being cruel, "Come on now, Ellie, be nice. Not everyone gets the chance to build something. Some men just weren't built for more than a hammer." And my daughter laughed. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the insult, the laugh. Bright, easy, unbothered, like I was a joke she'd told 100 times, and the punchline still worked. I looked at my wife, Diane, hoping for something. A hand on my arm, a word in my defense. She was 30 years my wife, or she had been, before the divorce 2 years back. But she was still standing right there at the same table, and she just stared down at the tablecloth like there was something fascinating printed on it. She had heard our daughter call me a hammer-swinging nobody in front of her whole new family, and she had said nothing. That was the moment something in my chest went very still and very cold. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up and make a scene. I set my napkin beside my untouched plate, the way you set down something you no longer need, and I looked at my daughter for a long moment. She was 30 years old, and she believed, completely and without a shadow of doubt, that everything in her life belonged to her. The catering business she'd started 4 years ago. The renovated brownstone she and Marcus were about to move into. The gleaming SUV parked out front, with a bow someone had tied on it for the engagement photos. She believed she had built all of it herself, with her own talent, her own hustle, her own hard work. She had no idea that I owned the building her catering kitchen operated out of. She had no idea I was the reason the bank had approved her first business loan when no one else would. She had no idea that with 3 phone calls made calmly without a single raised voice, every pillar holding up the life she was so proud of would come down inside of 72 hours. My name is Raymond Doyle. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years running a construction and property company out of Cedar Falls, Ohio, the kind of company you build slowly, brick by brick, contract by contract, until one day you look up and you own half the commercial real estate in a town nobody outside of it has ever heard of. I want to tell you exactly what happened after that party, because somewhere in the middle of telling it, I think you're going to ask yourself the same question I asked myself for weeks afterward. What would you have done if it was your daughter, and your money, and your silence being mistaken for weakness? I didn't raise a cruel woman. I need to say that clearly, because it would be easy for you to hear this story and decide Eleanor was simply born hard, born ungrateful. And that isn't true, and it isn't fair. My daughter had been raised inside a world that started telling her something different the moment her mother left our marriage 2 years ago and started keeping company with men like Marcus Whitfield's father, men who wore their money the way other men wear cologne, so you can smell it before they even walk into the room. Diane started saying things to Eleanor. Small things, at first. Comments about my truck. Comments about the modest house I stayed in after the divorce, the one I'd built with my own crew 22 years earlier. Comments about how a man my age should have more to show for himself. And Eleanor, who loved her mother and wanted to belong somewhere warm, absorbed every word of it like a plant leaning toward the only light in the room. The engagement party had been Marcus's parents' idea, hosted at their house on Larkspur Hill, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns are so uniform they look painted on. Marcus ran something he called a growth consultancy, which as far as I could tell involved a great deal of talking about disruption and very little actual disrupting. But the money was real enough, or it appeared to be, and appearance was the entire architecture of that family. I wore the same navy suit I'd worn to Eleanor's college graduation 12 years earlier. It still fit fine. I've never seen the sense in buying a new suit every time an old one still does its job, but standing in that backyard among linen blazers and watches that cost more than my first truck, I understood for the first time in my life what it felt like to be underdressed for my own daughter's happiness. Marcus had spent the better part of an hour holding court near the bar, telling a rotating audience about the second round of funding his consultancy had just closed, how investors were practically fighting over him, how he was thinking about finally trading in his sedan for something that matched his trajectory. Eleanor stood beside him, glowing, nodding along, telling anyone who'd listened that he'd worked so hard for all of it, that nobody understood how many hours he put in. And I said nothing, because I knew something none of them did. I knew exactly which bank had approved that funding round, because I sat on the small community lending board that had quietly voted to back it, at the request of a man who owed me a favor from 15 years back. I knew Marcus's consultancy had exactly one client that paid real money, and that client was a property management firm that, 3 layers of ownership removed, I controlled. I said nothing. I ate a piece of chicken I didn't taste, because all of my attention was fixed on the performance happening 6 feet in front of me. If you've ever sat at a table while the people who share your blood took inventory of your life and decided you came up short, you know exactly how that chicken tasted. Diane sat 2 seats down, and I barely recognized the woman I'd married in a small Methodist church 32 years before. She'd had highlights put in her hair that cost more than a month of my mortgage payments used to. She kept glancing at the Whitfields the way you glance at people you're trying to prove yourself worthy of, and then she looked at me and said, loud enough for the table to hear, that Eleanor had always had such vision, hadn't she? Such an eye for a better life. It wasn't a compliment. It was a measuring stick, and I was the thing being measured against it and found wanting. Marcus's father, a silver-haired man named Douglas Whitfield, who ran what he called a private capital group, leaned toward me at one point with the particular condescension of a man who has never once had to worry about a bounced check, and told me, kindly, the way you'd explain something to a child, that there was nothing wrong with a trade, nothing at all, but that real wealth required vision, required an appetite for risk that some men simply weren't built with. He said in this world, if you weren't investing, you were standing still, and standing still was its own kind of failure. Eleanor had nodded along at that too, agreeing that she'd tried for years to get me to see the bigger picture, to stop being so cautious, so small scale, so content with what she called my little truck and my little houses. Little, that was the word that night. Before that it had been modest. Before that simple. The word kept shrinking. The meaning behind it never did. Then, near the end of the night, after the cake had been cut and the toasts had been made and I had not been asked to give one, Eleanor stood up with her champagne glass in hand, a little unsteady, a little loud, and gestured from Marcus to me, and said it in front of everyone. That's the difference, Dad. Marcus built something. You just poured concrete for other people your whole life. And that was the moment the last thread in me went quiet and cold and very, very still. I stood. My chair didn't scrape. I set my napkin down beside a piece of cake I hadn't touched, and I looked at Diane, who wouldn't meet my eyes, and at Douglas Whitfield, who was watching me with something like satisfaction, and finally at my daughter, who was still holding her glass up, waiting for a reaction, waiting for me to argue, to defend myself, to give her the fight she seemed to want. I gave her nothing. I turned, and I walked out through the side gate, past the rented heaters and the string lights, and I didn't look back once. I didn't call a cab. I walked, 3 miles, through the quiet part of town where the streetlights are further apart and the houses are smaller and mean something, because somebody actually built them with their hands. My house came into view under the old sycamore tree I'd planted the year Eleanor was born, a modest brick 2-story I'd built myself with my own crew, and it wasn't flashy, it was solid, the way I'd tried to be my whole life. Inside, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't pour myself a drink, because I needed to be clear-headed, colder than I felt. I went into the small back room I used as an office, where the walls were covered in old blueprints and permits and photographs of buildings I'd raised out of nothing but dirt and lumber and stubbornness. On the corner of my desk sat a photograph of Eleanor at 6 years old, wearing my hard hat, laughing so hard she'd nearly fallen off my shoulders at a job site downtown. Where did I lose that girl? The question didn't hit me like pain. It hit me like something heavier. Something that had been building slowly for years and had finally arrived. I had believed, for a very long time, That quiet, steady love would be enough on its own, that I didn't need to compete for my daughter's respect with men who bought it in installments. I had been wrong. Unconditional love, I understood now, sitting in that small room, does not mean unconditional funding of someone else's fantasy about who they are. I sat down at my computer and opened a folder I hadn't touched in nearly 2 years. Inside were the real documents. The deed to the commercial building where Eleanor's catering kitchen operated, held under a holding company with a name that meant nothing unless you knew what it stood for. The loan guarantee I'd quietly co-signed 4 years earlier, when no bank in the county would touch a 26-year-old with no collateral and a business plan written on hope. The small consulting contract, funneled through 2 layers of ownership that made up the entirety of Marcus Whitfield's real income, dressed up to look like a thriving client roster. My daughter believed she had built a business from nothing. Marcus believed he had built an empire from ambition. Neither of them had ever asked why the ground beneath them had always felt so solid. It was solid because I had poured it myself. I opened an email to a woman named Patricia Alvarez, an attorney I'd trusted for over 20 years, who had helped me structure nearly every deal I'd ever made in this town. No pleasantries. Just a subject line, Cedar Protocol, and a single line beneath it. Begin unwinding, starting with the lease. I hit send. The room was silent except for the small sound of the message leaving. It was done. The next morning, Patricia met me at her office on the 3rd floor of the old Merchants Bank building, with 2 cups of black coffee already poured, because she knew exactly what that subject line meant and exactly how I liked to drink coffee when things had gotten serious. She sat across from me instead of behind her desk, and she asked me, gently, what had actually happened, because the legal documents wouldn't tell her that part. I told her my daughter had stood up in front of 60 people and called me a man who poured concrete for other people his whole life. Like that was something shameful, instead of something that had put a roof over her head for 18 years. I told her my ex-wife had sat there and said nothing. And I told her the worst part wasn't the insult. It was that Eleanor believed every word of it. She genuinely believed the life she was standing in belonged entirely to her. Patricia reminded me of something I already knew but needed to hear said out loud. 4 years earlier, when Eleanor had come to me with a business plan for a catering company, all passion and no capital, I could have simply written her a check for $80,000 and let her sink or swim on money she hadn't earned the meaning of. I'd known better. I'd told her, honestly, that most of what I had was tied up in property and long-term holdings, which was true, and that I couldn't just hand her that kind of money. Eleanor had been disappointed. She'd called me overly cautious, old-fashioned, and gone looking for financing on her own. But I hadn't walked away either. I'd gone to Patricia, and together we'd structured a loan guarantee through a small community bank, quiet enough that Eleanor never once thought to ask why a 26-year-old with no track record had been approved so easily. She believed a loan officer had simply seen her potential. She never asked who had actually vouched for her, in writing, with his own assets as collateral. Then there was the building, the commercial kitchen space she leased downtown, in a converted warehouse in the part of the city that had been getting fashionable for the last several years, had been purchased by one of my holding companies 3 years before she'd ever walked through its doors looking for a location. When her real estate agent had shown her the space, the property management company, working for me, had offered her a reduced rate specifically because they wanted a business with, in their words, character and story to help anchor the building's new identity. Eleanor had never read past the second page of that lease. Nobody ever does. The reduced rate was contingent, in language buried in an addendum, on continuous operation and, quietly, on the landlord's discretion. And then Marcus. This part, Patricia said, always felt different, and I admitted that it was, because it was as much about proving something to Diane as it was about my daughter. After the divorce, Diane had made it clear, in 100 small comments over 2 years, that she believed she had traded up, that Douglas Whitfield's world was the world Eleanor deserved to be raised into, if only I'd had the vision for it. Marcus's consultancy, the one everyone at that party had been so impressed by, had exactly one paying client of any real size, a property management firm operating 3 of my commercial buildings downtown. Marcus believed he'd won that contract on merit, out of a competitive pitch process. In reality, the property manager who'd hired him worked for me, and had been quietly instructed to give the boy a chance, because I'd wanted to understand exactly what kind of man my daughter was marrying. So there it was. The business, the building, the fiancé's entire professional identity. Every pillar either directly funded by me or made possible because of a phone call only I could have made. Patricia asked me what I wanted to do first, whether I wanted to hit everything at once, the lease, the loan, the contract, all in a single Monday morning phone call, and let the whole structure collapse in an afternoon. I shook my head. That's not correction, I told her. That's just cruelty with better paperwork. I explained it to her the way I'd explain it to a young foreman on a job site. When you need to take down a structure that's unsafe, you don't set off dynamite and hope for the best. You do a controlled demolition. You remove the load slowly, piece by piece, so the people inside have time to understand what's happening and why, instead of just being buried in the rubble of it. I didn't want to destroy my daughter's life. I wanted to take away the illusion, holding it up, and give her the chance to see what was actually true, one piece at a time. So we made a plan. Monday, the lease review would be triggered, a routine-looking notice that her reduced rate was under reassessment. Tuesday, the loan guarantee would be formally withdrawn, which would trigger the bank's own internal review of her credit line. Wednesday, Marcus's consulting contract would be quietly allowed to lapse at its natural renewal date. No drama, just a line item that simply wasn't renewed. Over that weekend, I mowed my lawn and fixed a leaning fence post and thought about very little at all, while, I learned much later, my daughter and Marcus told the story of the engagement party to anyone who'd listen, laughing about how her father had stormed off like a wounded animal, certain I'd call within a few days to apologize, the way I always had before. Monday came, and Eleanor arrived at her kitchen to find a notice taped politely to the door, informing her that her lease's preferred rate was under review due to a change in building ownership strategy, effective in 30 days, and that her new monthly rate, at full market value, would be roughly triple what she'd been paying. She called the property management office in a panic and was told, professionally and without any warmth at all, that the decision had come from ownership and wasn't up for discussion. Tuesday, she went to the bank to try to get ahead of it, to see about a short-term loan to cover the increase, and was informed, gently but clearly, that the guarantee that had backed her original line of credit had been formally withdrawn by the guarantor, and that without it, her existing credit line was now under review, and further extensions were, for the moment, off the table. She sat in the bank parking lot, I found out later, and cried for 20 minutes before she could drive home. And Wednesday, Marcus came home pale, having learned that his firm's only substantial contract had quietly not been renewed, a decision made, he was told, at the ownership level of the client company, with no further explanation offered. His entire consultancy, it turned out, had one real leg to stand on, and it had just been gently, legally, permanently removed. That night, my phone rang. It was Eleanor. Her voice, when I answered, wasn't the bright, easy voice from the engagement party. It was small, and it was shaking, and it took her almost a full minute to get any actual words out. She asked me if I knew anything about it, the lease, the bank, Marcus's contract, all in the same week. She said it sounded insane, even as she said it, but she needed to ask. I told her the truth, calmly, the way I'd say anything else. I told her yes. I told her all of it had come from me. There was a long silence on the line, and then she asked me, in a voice I hadn't heard from her since she was small enough to be afraid of thunderstorms, why. I asked her to come over. Not to argue, just to sit down and let me explain. She arrived less than an hour later. And I want you to understand something about this next part, because it's the longest, most important stretch of this whole story, and it deserves to be told slowly, the way it actually happened. I met her at the door instead of waiting in my office, because I didn't want this conversation to feel like a summons. She looked exhausted, mascara smudged at the corners of her eyes, still wearing the blazer she must have put on that morning, believing it was going to be a normal day. I made 2 cups of coffee, the way I used to when she was a teenager, and needed to talk about something that scared her, and we sat down at my kitchen table, the same table she'd done her homework on 20 years earlier. She asked me again, quieter this time, why. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told her that 4 years ago, when she'd needed a loan no bank would give her on her own, I had guaranteed it, quietly, because I believed in her, and because I loved her, and because I understood that if I'd simply handed her the money outright, she would never have learned what it actually cost to build something. I told her the building she leased belonged to me, that the reduced rate had never been the market recognizing her talent. It had been her father, working behind the scenes, the way fathers sometimes do. Her face went through something complicated while I talked. Disbelief first, and then a kind of dawning horror, and then something that looked almost like grief. The grief of watching a version of yourself you'd been proud of quietly dissolve. And then I told her about Marcus. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that his consultancy's only real client was a company I controlled, that the contract had never been about his talent. It had been about a father wanting to understand exactly what kind of man his daughter was choosing to spend her life with, before it was too late to matter. Eleanor put her face in her hands. She asked me, in a voice muffled by her own palms, if Marcus knew. I told her I didn't know, and that it likely didn't matter either way, because whether he'd known or not, he had spent the better part of a year telling anyone who'd listen that he'd built something real, entirely on his own, and either he'd been lying to everyone around him, or he'd been lying to himself, and I wasn't sure which one was worse. She was quiet for a long time, and then she asked me the question that told me everything I needed to know about whether this had actually reached her. She asked me if I'd taken it all away because I wanted to hurt her. I told her no. I told her I'd taken away the illusion because I loved her too much to keep letting her build her entire sense of self on a foundation she didn't know was mine. I told her that, at the party, when she'd called me a man who just poured concrete, I hadn't been angry about the words themselves. I'd been heartbroken because she genuinely believed them, because somewhere in the last few years, she'd stopped being able to see the difference between a man who builds something real and slow with his own hands, and a man who performs success for an audience. I told her the money was still there, that nothing had been stolen, only revealed, and that if she wanted to keep the kitchen, keep the business, keep building the life she was proud of, she was more than welcome to, at market rate, with a loan she qualified for on her own merit this time, the same way every other small business owner in this town had to. And then I told her the hardest thing. I told her that whatever she decided about Marcus was hers to decide, not mine, but that she owed it to herself to find out, clearly and honestly, whether the man she was about to marry had built anything real at all, or whether, like her, he'd simply been standing on ground someone else had poured for him. She didn't say much else that night. She finished her coffee, and she left, and I didn't hear from her for 11 days. Those 11 days were some of the quietest I'd known in years. No calls demanding I fix things, no manufactured emergencies. Just an old man mowing his lawn and fixing his fence and sitting on his back porch in the evenings, watching the fireflies come up out of the grass the way they had every summer of my life. On the 12th day, my phone rang, and it was Diane. Her voice, when I picked up, was nothing like the woman who'd sat silent at that party. It was fast and high and cracking at the edges. Marcus had left, she told me. The moment the money dried up, he'd started distancing himself from Eleanor within a week, some excuse about needing space to think, and Douglas Whitfield's private capital group, it turned out, had been quietly overextended for over a year, propped up by exactly the kind of borrowed confidence that collapses the second the money stops flowing convincingly. Diane wanted to know if I'd done that too. She wanted to know how far this went, how much of their world I'd actually been holding up without any of them knowing, and she wanted, more than anything, for me to fix it, because surely, she said, surely I still cared enough to fix it. I let her finish. I let the silence sit there afterward, the way I used to let silence sit at that dinner table for 30 years while she measured me against other men. And when I finally spoke, there was no anger in my voice, and no satisfaction either. Just a simple truth I'd earned the right to say. Diane, I told her, that's not my problem to fix anymore. I ended the call, and I set the phone face down on the porch railing, and I let the slow creak of my chair carry on the way it had before she called. Eleanor came back to see me 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, without calling first. She looked different, thinner around the face, older around the eyes, but steadier somehow, the way people look after they've been made to stand on their own feet for the first time in a while. She told me she'd taken out a real loan, on her own name, at a rate that actually reflected what a bank thought of her risk instead of what a hidden father was willing to guarantee. She told me it terrified her, and that some months she genuinely didn't know if the business would survive on its own weight. And then she told me something I hadn't expected, that for the first time in years, when she looked at what she'd built, it actually felt like hers. We sat on the porch together that evening, the way we used to when she was a girl, and she asked me, quietly, if I could ever forgive her for that night at the engagement party. I told her I already had. I told her the version of her that said those words hadn't really known who I was, or who she was either, and that both of those things were true now in a way they hadn't been before. I didn't get my daughter back because I punished her into submission. I got her back because I finally stopped being the invisible foundation under a life built on illusion and let her find out, the hard and honest way, what was actually true and what wasn't. I had spent 31 years building things that had to hold real weight, bridges and buildings and houses that couldn't afford to be dishonest about their own foundations, and it took me a long time to understand that people are exactly the same. You cannot love someone into strength by quietly carrying all their weight for them. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set it down and stand back and let them find out what they're actually made of. So let me ask you something before you go, because I genuinely like to know where you land on this. Comment 1 if you think I did exactly the right thing, that a controlled collapse was the only way my daughter was ever going to see the truth. Comment 2 if you think I went too far, that a father shouldn't quietly engineer his own daughter's downfall no matter the reason. Or comment 3 if you think the real fault lies with her mother, for spending 2 years teaching my daughter to measure a man's worth in watches and titles instead of what he actually builds with his own 2 hands. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is right now where you are, because it still amazes me how far a story like this can travel. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had absolutely no idea what you were quietly capable of, I want to hear about it, because I read every single comment. If this one meant something to you, stay a while longer. There are more stories like it here, about quiet people who get counted out too soon, and the exact moment the truth finally catches up. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end, and thank you, truly, for caring.